you're just like, why did that happen? Why God? Why this? Why that? Why that? But I kind of had to arrive at the conclusion of I don't know, and it's okay not to know. And now my choice is to choose trust and trust that God's a good Father.
It's our limiting beliefs that ultimately keep us from becoming the best we're capable of becoming. Something's got to change, but that change has to happen first on the inside. It's time to get unstuck. It's time to get your why back. It's never too late. Let's start today.
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey, my friends, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for the download. As always, this is episode 140 of Win Today, and this is your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out, body, mind, and spirit. I'm really pumped you're here for today's conversation, but I want to start by asking you a question, and it's this. As talented, gifted, and enthusiastic as each and every one of you are, how many of you will be honest and admit there are days you wake up wishing you had what someone else has? Or even worse, you wake up wishing you were someone else. I know I have. Many times in my life, I've stewed in comparison and jealousy, wishing I had someone else's talent, someone else's favor, someone else's last name, someone else's income, and someone else's opportunity. And you know what I was left with after all of that? Absolutely none of those things. Instead, I was left with distraction and depression and complete depletion of passion and energy for the unique purpose for which I was created. And truth be told, my friends, learning how to discover and then stay in our unique lane is a fundamental key to living a life of significance. And that is the story of today's guest, Ryan Hall. Ryan Hall posted the best ever American times in the half marathon and marathon and has represented the United States in the 2008 and 2012 Olympic Games. But growing up, Ryan hated running. He wanted nothing to do with it until one day he felt compelled to run the 15-mile trek around his neighborhood lake. 15 miles in his first run ever. Suffice to say, he was hooked. Starting that day, Ryan felt a sense of God-given purpose in running. In fact, he knew he could and would race with the best runners in the world, and that his talent would open doors to help others discover their own sense of purpose in life. Undergirded by those two beliefs, Ryan's 20-year professional running career led him to the highest highs and through devastating failures. Throughout his journey, though, Ryan learned how to focus on his purpose and say no to distractions, to select and strive for the right goals for the heart as well as for the body. Fueled by a sense of purpose as he trekked millions of miles in his career, Ryan discovered secrets to dealing with defeat and disappointment, enduring immense pain, building resilience, and ultimately running as if you've already won. And that, my friend, is exactly what you're going to learn today. Right now, let's get to my conversation with Olympic runner Ryan Hall. Ryan, I'm really excited to have this conversation today. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, Chris.
You're welcome. Well, Ryan, before we dive full on into the conversation, I'd love for my friends listening today to get to know you a bit more. You hold the American record for the half marathon and have the fastest marathon time ever run by an American. Where did this passion for running start? Take us back.
Yeah, well, it was not natural, I can tell you that. When I was a kid growing up in Big Bear Lake in Southern California, I hated to run. I didn't see a purpose behind it. And yet I was still forced to run in like middle school PE class, and I would still run those we'd run a mile for time like every week or something. And I would run those miles hard just because I like doing things that are hard, and I was good at it. Like I'd set a school record, but I just did not enjoy it at all. And really that all changed one day. I was going down to a basketball game, and I remember just looking out at Big Bear Lake and just feeling like God was kind of challenging me to run around the lake. And I think that's so cool that like God knows us so well that he knows like what's going to capture our heart and what we're likely to respond to. And like just how he created me is like, I just love challenges, you know?
Yeah.
And so he kind of put that challenge in my mind. I was like, oh, I got to do it. I got to do it. And so I went home, I told my dad about it. And I'm really grateful that my dad wasn't like, this is a really bad idea, son. Like, you're 13 years old, it's 15 miles around the lake. Most people do not start running with a 15-mile run. But instead of saying that, he just said, oh, cool. Like, if God's leading you to do this, like, let's go do it together. So
Wow.
we laced up our shoes. I was in basketball shoes because that's all I had, and went for a very long, slow, painful run around the lake filled with blisters and stopping to ice our legs in the frigid water and stopping for Sobeys, the drink Sobe along the way.
Yeah.
And then I just came home from that run. I remember being so tired, just collapsing in the couch. And I think this is kind of like a side tangent, but for me, I always can hear God speak to me way more clearly when I'm physically exhausted.
Really?
So yeah, like it just quiets my mind, I mean, running in general, it's a lot easier for me to hear God just because you don't have the distractions, the cell phone, the music, all that stuff. But also too, just being really, really tired just quiets my mind down. And there's something about that connection with God that's it makes it a lot easier for me. So kind of in that moment, laying on the couch, I felt like God was telling me, I've given you a gift to run with the best guys in the world, but I gave you that gift so that you could help other people. So, I knew what it meant to try to run with the best guys in the world. I'd seen the Olympics before, and that was first thought in my mind was the Olympic Games. But I didn't know how you help other people through running. Like, it seems like a sport, and it took me a good 15 years before I figured out that you can help people through running.
So I gotta pause and ask: did you, from that day, your first run was 15 miles?
Yep.
Oh my gosh! And did you have this desire not just to do that 15, but there was something in you that said, I was created to do this? I mean, did you say, okay, I'm going to be in the Olympics after that first run? How does that happen?
Well, yeah, it did happen for me in that moment on the couch when I felt like God was telling me I'd run with the best guys in the world. From that moment on, I believe that was my destiny. And I'm so grateful that I had that, because you can see why cockiness in athletes is a common characteristic, because you have to believe that you are going to do great things. Because when you believe you're going to do great things, you train that way, you live your life that way, you eat that way, you sleep that way. Like, it spills over into every bit of your life, because it's a belief of like who you are and where you're going. And so it was super powerful. So I was, I loved the experience of finally getting there years later and running with the best guys in the world and going to the Olympics, and the experiences I got to have. But I wasn't surprised by them, because I knew in that moment. And I always like to tell people, like, it looks different for everyone, So maybe you haven't had this moment on the couch, but God is trying to speak to all of us and trying to reveal our destiny to all of us. And he might reveal that differently to you than he did to me. But just to be listening to God, and asking him questions and going after that, and allowing other people also to speak into your life and call out the gold in your life and your talents and abilities.
Ryan, you said something that I don't want to move past too quickly, and you said belief. So how did you develop belief? It doesn't just arrive one day and then you have it. How do you practice belief? How do you keep it going? And how did you keep that engine running? I think that's a good place to start in the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Belief, I kind of see it as a seed almost. It's like I had the seed in that moment when I was on the couch and I was 13. And then I started moving. I started training. I started living the lifestyle I needed to develop that belief. But one of the huge things that really helped me, especially early on in my journey when I was in high school, was having my dad there and him just like continually just like pummeling me with positive self-talk. And I think it's so important that we surround ourselves with people who are going to do that for us, who are going to just give us positive self-talk, because you're going to go through a whole bunch of hard times. And like for myself, high school, college, like it was just filled with races where I'd get last place, run really, really poorly. So you just got to have people in your life that are speaking life into your life. Mm-hmm. And so that was a big part of kind of step one of me kind of cultivating that belief. And then the other part is like I said, you start moving, you start training, and then you start to see results. So, the results kind of build momentum. They kind of confirm things. And then you get tastes and glimpses of things that are to come. And I felt like that's kind of what my story was at Stanford. Was almost all my races did not go well, but I had a couple races in there where I just felt like God's giving me like a glimpse of things to come. He's given me just enough hope to continue on this journey. And so I really, and I write about this in my book, about building monuments to God, and these things that have happened in my life where I'm being like, I feel like stopping right now, but I remember like when God did this at the NCAA championships in cross country, and how amazing that experience was, and just building kind of your faith around these successes.
Ryan, I want to kind of create an action point for our friends that are literally in this conversation with us right now, and almost to set up an equation. It's belief plus what equals results. So you said belief, but then there's another part of this equation that combines with belief that equals results. What is that? What's that missing X?
The first thing that comes to my mind is work. Belief plus work, and you kind of see that like with the Gospels. It's, there's this tension between like your works show like your heart, but then it goes the other way around as well, so like you kind of got to have both. And I think it's the same thing with belief. It's great to like have the belief, but if you're not going out there and actively like cultivating that belief and working towards it, then I don't know. Yeah. I know for myself personally, like it would never work in the running space. Maybe there's other areas of life where that would work, and I'd never limit God. Like he could show up and just make things happen. But I know, like through my own personal experience, if I would not have had the self-discipline, the desire to train and just work really, really hard, things wouldn't have happened the way they happened.
There's one more aspect to this, Ryan, that I want to focus on, because I think it'd be easy for people listening to say, okay, I believe in myself. I really believe strongly. I want this. I have a desire for this one thing. I'm willing to put in the work, but I think there's one more piece of that equation, Ryan, and there's a grace for it. In other words, there's talent for it. There's actually ability. And so maybe people have been frustrated saying, hey, I've tried this. I really want this, maybe. I really want this. I have a passion for it. I believe I can, but I keep hitting a wall. At what point do we have to say, you know what, maybe I'm just not gifted in this? How do we recognize that piece? When do we say, okay, it's time to move on to something else?
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think that is part of the equation. And I think that's when you just got to take a good look at like your gifts and abilities and be like, is the direction I'm going lined up with my own gifts and abilities? And yeah, so just falling back on that and following the gifts. If you follow like how God made you, you're gonna win. It's gonna work out well.
And then Ryan, fast forward, all of that took you to the Olympics twice. I mean, tell us about what that looks like. I mean, from the training to the experience of performing on a global stage.
Yeah, the Olympics was such an amazing experience, and I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity. But it did not unfold, necessarily how I would have dreamt it up or planned, or even, I felt like God had given me a vision that everything was going to click in London and I was going to have my best day ever, and that did not happen at all. So I wrote about this more in the chapter about the Beijing Olympics, about dealing with my own personal like offense towards God when he doesn't show up the way I want him to show up. And in London, I ended up dropping out of that race with a hamstring injury, and it was the first race I had ever dropped out of in my life, and it was really a hard moment for me. But I remember, coming past because it was a loop course in London, and the course was just packed with people going crazy. It was the most exciting atmosphere I've ever raced in. Like, I felt like I was in the Tour de France with all the people just right on you. And I remember coming past the finish line after the first loop, and having 3 more loops to go, but deciding, I'm limping, and I'm willing to like be that guy who limps into the stadium like 4 hours after the winners come in, if that's what God wants me to do. But in my conversation with God in that moment, I felt like he was telling me to live to fight another battle another day, and to not punish my body and cause long lasting pain that was going to set me back further. And I also felt like he was telling me it's better to lose with me than to win without me. And that was just kind of encouraging me that like, let's keep the main thing. And like, there's nothing sweeter, nothing better, no experience we could have, even winning a gold medal, that is greater than knowing God. And so that just kind of gave me the peace I needed to be able to let go and be like, oh, it's not my day, but I can let go of it. I can trust that God's good, and I can trust that he has something down the line in my future for me that I need to live to fight.
Ryan, in your own experience, you alluded to this. You said you were disappointed with God. Now, disappointment is inevitable in life. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen. It's a matter of when it's going to happen, and then how we're going to navigate through it. So the question is, what are some really practical things you did to be able to navigate successfully through disappointment to ensure that you lived an unoffendable life? I think that's really key for all of us to listen to.
Yeah, I know for me, a big part of it was just embracing mystery. Like, I had the why question going through my mind for a long, long time after both Beijing and London, where you're just like, why did that happen? Why God? Why this? Why that? Why that? But I kind of had to arrive at the conclusion of, I don't know, and it's okay not to know, and now my choice is to choose trust, and trust that God's a good father. And my experience in Beijing kind of helped me a lot in London to deal with that disappointment, because in Beijing I was running my last run before the Olympic Games, and I remember asking God for a word, and I felt like he was reminding me of the passage of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how when the Nebuchadnezzar threw them into the fire and God showed up, but I loved their response to the king before he threw them in the fire. And when they were like, even if God doesn't show up, like, we'll never bow down and worship you. And is that kind of like unoffendableness in their heart, where they're like, listen, like, God doesn't even have to show up, but like we will stay resolute in our beliefs. And that kind of helped me, because then the next day in Beijing I had a really tough day, ended up finishing 10th when I was hoping to podium. And that helped me though to just be like, I can trust that God knows what's best for me, and I need to be able to not hold God to performance standards and hold him to my list of, this is how I want you to show up.
That's really powerful. Ryan, the title of your book is Run the Mile You're In. I think that's really powerful because it insinuates that we need to squash distractions as they come in life. I'd love to ask, what are a few distractions you've dealt with in your life?
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's a lot more now that I'm a dad. I mean, not that my kids are distractions, but just I have actually a lot more going on now. When I was running professionally, life was actually pretty simple and not as glamorous as you think it would be for a professional athlete. Like, I basically hunkered down in a small town in Mammoth Lakes or Flagstaff or in Ethiopia or Kenya, and just trained, ate, and slept, and that was it. So distractions were very minimized kind of throughout my career. But I would say this might not be thought of as a distraction, but it was for me, was this whole aspect of like comparison, and even like comparing myself to myself. I always like held myself to really high standards, and so it was very easy for me to look back at previous workouts and be comparing my fitness level now compared to then, and being frustrated with myself. I wasn't making progress or whatnot, and so I was kind of in a way distracted by this need to perform. And so kind of what helped me deal with that was actually a passage that really hit me hard. I forget at what point in my career, but it's the passage in John. It's the end of John. And Jesus is talking to Peter and telling Peter how he's going to die. And Peter's response to Jesus is, well, what about him? Pointing to John the Baptist. And Jesus tells him, if I want him to remain till the end, what is that to you? You follow me. And that just like hit me super, super hard. I was like, man, I'm so focused on like what God has for other people, how I stack up relative to everyone else in America or the world. And I'm not just like following hard after God. And so that was probably the biggest distraction that I faced throughout my career, is like not being sidetracked about what someone else is doing or what God has for someone else, but just rather focus on God who's right in front of me and just staying as close to him as I can.
That's a really mature perspective, Ryan, but I think it takes time to develop, because even as you're saying that, I'm going, man, I actually really struggle with that. I want to take things into my own hands. I think one of the biggest fears I have in my own life is the fear of losing control. And so when I feel like I wrap my hands around things tighter. And so it's harder to trust. It's harder to kind of develop that muscle. What are some of the daily rhythms that you did to help make that reflex in your character almost kind of reflexive?
Yeah. Well, first off, I haven't mastered it. I feel like, a lot
That's
of
good
these
to know.
lessons.
That makes me feel better.
Well, a lot of the lessons that I wrote about in the book and that I've experienced and learned, like they're not one-time lessons. It's like a daily choosing to align myself with what I learned in that moment and to choose to grow. And I don't always make the right choice, like I slip back into comparison. Sometimes I go on Instagram and I'm into weightlifting now, and I look and there's like girls lifting way more than I am. And it's easy to be like, oh man, I'm not even good at this, so yeah, I struggle as well. But I would say for me, what I found to be most effective is just getting in the presence of God. Like if I'm full of his spirit and full of his presence and, living out of the spirit rather than living out of the flesh, I just find that a lot of my problems and struggles, I'm just not as aware of them or just don't experience them as much.
I think three things, and you just touched on comparison, but I think three of the most devastating things people deal with, I deal with, are number one, comparison, number two, jealousy, and then number three, entitlement. I think they're devastating threats to our potential. Can you speak from your own experience about those three and then how to combat their power over our mind?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, we talk about jealousy. I remember when I was in high school, my goal was to break 4 minutes for the mile. And I remember watching a high school kid who's my same year, Alan Webb, break 4 minutes. He ran 3:53 for a mile when he was in high school. And I remember after that, I went to church and I was like so upset in church. And we like played a pickup game of basketball after church. And I think I got in a fight with one of the kids. And I was just so hot, So that was one example of many that I've kind of had throughout my career, where kind of like what I was talking about earlier, it's just so easy to look at someone else's journey, especially in today's age with social media and stuff. Like you see highlight reels of everyone's life and you're like jealous that they're going to this place and doing that and having this experience. So I think just kind of going back to what I said before with jealousy, of just like being thankful for what God has for you. I think it's very difficult to be thankful and jealous at the same time. So it's like, rather than like focusing on something you're trying not to do, I always try to focus on what I do want to be like. And so, whenever I kind of feel myself slipping into that, that mindset of being jealous of someone else, I kind of just remind myself of all the things I'm thankful for and all the experiences I've had that I'm thankful for.
It's really interesting you went there, Ryan, because I was just thinking as you were talking, 10 years ago, I would have never said, oh, one of my surfacey semi-professional goals is to have 20,000 followers on Instagram or whatever. Like, things are moving at such a pace today that the goals and the targets we want to hit as a culture, as a society, sounds so silly once we put them out in the light. So I think that's where that jealousy thing just plays at us then. How do we stay focused amidst a distraction like that?
I definitely don't have this all figured out either, but
right.
I just know, like, being in the presence of God makes a lot of stuff melt away,
Yeah. Renewing the mind comes to mind as you're talking about this, Ryan. And renewing the mind, I believe, is absolutely key for success in life. But it's not simply changing what we think about. I think it's more specifically changing how we think. And as you've faced both failure and success in life, how have the mechanics of your thought life changed?
Yeah, I write a lot about my kind of thought life in my book. And one of the things that I think has changed a lot is how I view those negative thoughts. So, for example, I have a lot of memories from running the Boston Marathon and the lead group getting away from me, and then all these negative thoughts coming into my mind about how my day's over, the race is over, like, this is so terrible. All of these negative thoughts come flooding in as the guys are running away from me.
Yeah.
And I had to kind of learn that, number one, to have grace for myself and be like, okay, I'm having this thought, but this thought is not who I am. And then to use that negative thought as a cue that I needed to reinforce the opposite of that to myself in that moment. Because obviously, like, I'm really struggling with this issue right now. And so I can look at it, I can believe the thought, or I can look at it and identify it and be like, this is a negative thought. I'm going to declare the opposite of it. And I do this now with my kids. I was doing it the other day, and it's kind of awkward at first. Like, my daughter was saying, like, I'm not good at math or something like that. And I was like, okay, we need to do some declarations. Like, I want you to say out loud, I am currently struggling with math, but I'm going to grow and get better in this area of my life, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And she did not want to say that at all and was fighting me on it. But eventually she did say it, and I made her say it a couple times. And I could tell, like, it did kind of help shift the atmosphere inside of her. And she was able to kind of work through that negative thought. So I always just tell people, and I tell myself this too, if I'm having a negative thought, I'm going to use that as a cue to declare the opposite and speak truth to the lies that are coming into my mind.
That's really good. I think denial is stupid, and it's silly. Like you just said, even with your daughter, it'd be silly to say things like, oh, I'm amazing at math, but you actually kind of do struggle with it. It's okay to acknowledge the struggle. And what I want people to understand, it's okay to not acknowledge where you're struggling. It's just to say, amidst the struggle, you have an opportunity to grow and to learn and to become better, right? Is that what I hear you saying?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head.
That's good. Ryan, what's the greatest disappointment you've ever faced, and how did you navigate through it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the greatest disappointment was probably the London Olympics, and how I navigated through it was cinnamon rolls. That's kind of a joke, but kind of true too. I did indulge in a cinnamon roll, but that's a completely separate story. But yeah, that, the kind of a brief backstory on that is in 2011, I was running on a professional team in Mammoth Lakes and decided that I was just really desperate to hear God, and so I wanted to step out in faith. So I kind of stepped out away from the team and started doing kind of faith-based coaching, where basically I just applied everything God was telling me, and I was reading in Scripture, and I applied it to my running, and essentially like God was my coach. And so, and things had clicked really well right after I made that decision. I ran 2:04 at the Boston Marathon and qualified for my second Olympic team, and just believed. And I felt like God was speaking to me a lot, and I was getting better at hearing God. I made a lot of mistakes along the way in trying to hear Him, but I was just really excited about where my faith was at, where my connection with God was, and just the direction I was going. And then London happened, and I had a little injury in the Olympic trials. I had plantar fasciitis actually about the last month leading up to the Olympic trials, and had to run through that. And then that kind of led to the ultimate problem with the hamstring in the London Olympics. And how I dealt with kind of that disappointment was just to realize that like I have the best gift that I can ever have. Like, knowing God through the blood of Jesus is the single greatest thing I can experience in this life. And that having that reality just frees you up to like go for your dreams, go for big goals, and not have the fear of failure with those. So it's one of those, like we talked about earlier, decisions where it's not a one-time view or perspective. It's a perspective that you have to cultivate and continue to remind yourself of, and ideally have people around you that are reminding you of those same things.
Yeah, that's so good. How often do you still battle with self-criticism and self-doubt, even amidst all your accomplishments as a professional athlete?
Yeah, it's still to this day, it's a daily thing, that I have to work through. Because when you look back at least when I look back at my career, I see the things I did well, but I also see like the things that maybe if I'd done them differently, things would have worked out differently. So it's easy to focus on those things and criticize yourself for those decisions that you made or how you navigated life in that season. And for me, like I go back to thankfulness. When I find myself reliving the past, I just pull myself back and be like, I'm so thankful that I got to experience X, Y, and Z.
That's really good. Ryan, I think too that a lot of times challenges cause us to forget former victories. And in my own life, remembering what has been done builds my faith for what could be done and whatever I'm facing. How's this played out in your own life?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, my victories and my failures, I've learned so much and grown so much through them. I would just say, the victories, we just need to remember, like, that it wasn't, we need to remember the road also to those victories. And so like the road to, like, for example, before I ran 2:04 at the Boston Marathon, I ran one of my worst half marathons of all time, 5 weeks prior to that race. So I ran like, I think 65 minutes, something like that for a half marathon. And then fast forward 5 weeks later, I ran the Boston Marathon, perhaps my best race of all time, came through the halfway point, 61:52, But it's easy for me to remember the good race, but to like block out and not remember that also like failure was a part of that journey, is a big step that I had to navigate to get to my greatest success. And I write about that in my book, about how sometimes, your greatest successes are laying just beyond your greatest failures.
Ryan, I think we know what it means to be led by fear, but what does it mean to be led by love, really practically? What's the empowerment within that statement?
Yeah, that was, love was the driving factor that led to my wife and I adopting 4 sisters from Ethiopia a little over 3.5 years ago. Yeah. And, I had a lot of fear about adopting the girls, and the fear wasn't like afraid of the girls. I was afraid of myself. I was afraid of my inadequacies and my having never done this before, and all the fears that first-time parents have. But then at the same time, I just had all this love in my heart that I felt like God put there for the girls. And so I felt like when I'm at my best, I'm always making decisions based on love and led by love. So that was kind of probably the biggest decision I've ever made in my life, that was just led by love and love in the face of fear. But I'm so glad that, my wife and I decided to adopt our girls. They've brought so much joy and fullness to our life. And I'm just loving being a dad and seeing them grow and seeing them take on their own challenges.
It's so good. Ryan, as we close out our conversation today, I'd love for you to leave us with some encouragement, even some practical, actionable items that we could all take to life this week to make sure that we're staying in our lane, that we're running in the mile we're in, so to speak. How do we do it?
Yeah, that's why I wrote the book, and why I landed on the title that we landed on is because a big part of my journey has been learning to navigate pain and suffering. And what I found for myself is, if I'm terrified on the starting line of a marathon because I am worried about all the miles to come. And we kind of talked about this earlier in our conversation about grace for the moment. And that's really been my experience. When I am focused on the mile that I'm running and just doing a good job, being present and being fully focused on what I'm doing right now, that's when I'm at my best. And also too, if you're so worried about the road that's in front of you that's too hard for you, like I can't even navigate it, because by the time I get there, I'm so tired from all the worry about it. It's the worry about it that's worse than actually traveling the road. So it's been one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn, is just to be present, be in the mile that I'm in, and also to be thankful for whatever God has for me each mile of my journey.
Powerful words. Ryan Hall, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really impacted by your perseverance and your grit. It's really awesome, man. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. I enjoyed the conversation.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed that. As we said in the conversation, I really believe that when we discover and stay in the lane for which we were created, we're going to live a life of significance. And so just to recap a couple of the statements from our conversation with Ryan, he said that we have to learn how to keep the main thing the main thing. It's kind of how I opened the show and said, it's too easy to be distracted by what's happening for other people, what's working for other people. And what happens when we do that is we totally miss the purpose for which we were created. To that, Ryan said, it's difficult to be thankful and jealous at the same time. Think about that. I'm going to say it again. It's difficult to be thankful, to have a deep-seated heart of gratitude and harbor jealousy at the same time. He went on to say this. He said, an unoffendable life is a stable life. How many of us go through life every single day being ticked off and offended by what other people said, other people did, and what didn't work out in life? And the result of that is oftentimes we live as victims of life, just laying under the weight of what didn't work, what didn't happen. Poor me. It's not to invalidate the hard stuff, guys. It's just to say that if in all things we are more than conquerors, we're going to have to conquer something. And we're going to have to decide that what Jesus did for us is greater than what happened to us. And as such, we can develop the perseverance, the resilience, the tenacity to develop our character to actually be a contributor and make a difference in this life. Let's go. I know I'm really passionate about it, but listen, we have one life to live. What are we going to do with it? What are you going to do with it, my friend? Hey, next week on the show, we're talking all about making the decisions that matter for your life. In other words, a lot of us are faced with many decisions throughout each and every day. But the key to doing so is understanding that it's not about making all the decisions. It's about making the next right decision. And joining us is Emily P. Freeman to talk about this very subject. Here's a preview.
It's really scary. And I would say this conversation is so important because I think most people don't even realize that's what's happening. beneath the surface, they're just moving through life feeling like they're bad decision makers and they can't trust themselves. And that really shapes your actual life. Like the choices that we make shape our life. And what an opportunity, but also what a scary thing if we're not aware that that's what's happening.
That's next week right here on Win Today. Don't miss my conversation with Emily P. Freeman as we unpack and discuss how to do the next right thing in any and every area of your life. Well, guys, thanks again for joining today's conversation. I really trust it has been a value add. And if it has, would you do me a favor right now? And that's go to iTunes or the Apple Podcast app on your device and rate and write a review of the show. In doing so, you're helping me grow the exposure of the show, which helps me help people just like you design their roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. And hey, let's hang out on social media. I am ridiculously easy to find. I'm at 00 Chris Cook on Instagram, on Twitter, and of course on Facebook as well. Lastly, wintoday.tv, where you will find blog posts and archive podcasts in areas of body, mind, and spirit, which are all aimed at helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. Have an awesome week. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.